This is the Whimsy Farm Podcast.
There's a big wide world right out your door. Good people doing good things. Whoa, it's a big, big wide world. Now is the time. Now is our time.
Welcome to episode 1 of the Whimsy Farm Podcast. I'm Carolyn Crane, and I'm excited to be here with you to talk with good people doing good things for social and environmental justice. We have 2 guests today. First, Seth Donnelly from Taxpayers Against Genocide will talk about the movement to hold our elected representatives accountable. Then we'll hear from Kim Bateman, writer and end-of-life doula, about navigating grief in today's troubled political climate. Seth Donnelly is the author of The Lie of Global Prosperity: How Neoliberals Distort Data to Mask Poverty and Exploitation. He teaches high school in Northern California. Seth and I talked over Zoom on March 28th about his latest project, Taxpayers Against Genocide. Today on the podcast, we're welcoming Seth Donnelly of Taxpayers Against Genocide. Welcome, Seth.
Thank you, Carolyn. Good to be here.
So tell us a little bit about this organization that you founded last year, I believe.
Yeah, so I'm out in the in Northern California, just outside the Bay Area, and like many folks throughout the country, there's been tremendous, like many folks who were involved and have, in the solidarity work with Palestine, particularly, with the intensification of genocide following October 7th, 2023. And lots of folks out here we were taking to the streets. We were trying to get ceasefire resolutions passed through our city councils. We were consistently reaching out to our Congress folks and urging them to cut off funding of military aid and to stop facilitating weapon sales to Israel. And for the most part, this was all in vain. Like, I mean, the energy and the movement building on the streets was certainly not in vain, that we were building communities of resistance. But in terms of resolutions, ceasefire resolutions, it was oftentimes we would up against walls with the city councils where people just wouldn't want to take that stand. And our Congress folks were continuing to double down and send our tax dollars in the form of military aid. So last August, myself and some other activists in this area decided to protest our congressperson, our representative in the House, Mike Thompson. He was having a summer annual fundraising event outside of an opulent winery in the Sonoma County area. And so we set up a picket and we started talking about the need for legal action. And at that point, I was in communication with a progressive attorney out here, Dean Royer, a member of the National Lawyers Guild, and we started looking into the case that congresspersons cannot use our tax dollars with absolute impunity and with full latitude to fund genocide. We developed a case that grounded, and still very much believe this, grounded in a correct reading of the Constitution and, of course, international law, that even though Congress has wide parameters as to what with their power of the purse, their appropriations power, that isn't absolute. So they can't, for example, take our tax dollars and reinstitute slavery. And so we did find a Supreme Court case from 1968, Flass versus Cohen, which established that taxpayers can have standing to challenge government officials when their tax dollars are used in an unconstitutional manner. In that case, it had to do with tax dollars being used for private religious schooling purposes in violation of the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause. So we went to work, and activists and lawyers, we developed our case, and we developed a class that grew to 2,000 class members up and down the 18 counties in Northern California. Um, that are all these counties from Santa Cruz and all the way up to the Oregon, to the border of Oregon. All of these counties are under the same jurisdiction, the same federal district court, the federal district court of Northern California, located in San Francisco. And so within this corridor of 18 counties, we developed a class of 2,000 taxpayers, plaintiffs, that named their congresspersons as defendants, and we sued them for illegally using our tax dollars to fund the genocide in Gaza. And the case was filed this last December, on December 19th, the first iteration of the class action, and then it was amended on the 17th of January, this last January, to again encompass even these full 18 counties. The earlier version was just 10 counties, and then it grew through popular interest. And so it included our Congressperson, Mike Thompson, who was the catalyst for this action, but also all Congresspersons like Nancy Pelosi, the California senators, Representative Ginny Panetta out of Santa Cruz, who takes a lot of APAC money, um, and Representative Jared Huffman, another rep up here in Northern California, etc. All of the reps and senators that voted last April to send 26.38 billion more in military aid to Israel, and military aid, were named as defendants, and we charged them in this lawsuit with um, unconstitutionally using our tax dollars to fund genocide, and so that's just a little background for you.
So talk about what this is going to accomplish. What do you hope to accomplish, and what are the steps toward any final goal you have?
Well, the underlying goal is always to build the grassroots mass movement. And so as this thing took on, and so many people here and all over the country were and are ready to really deal more directly with the source of the genocide, which is our federal government, it's our tax dollars. Without the United States providing the military aid and the weapons to Israel, the genocide would not be possible. And so everybody here, at least many of us, were just really ready to take it to that step. And it's that kind of mass grassroots movement to have a class, for example, of 2,000 class members, and we developed 60 some organizations involved in it, and so we called this movement Taxpayers Against Genocide, and it's now been spreading across the U.S. In other areas. But the goal is to build that movement, because it's only the organized power of the people that can stop what the government's doing and ultimately restructure the government in a way, our government, the source of it, the problem. It's not to take the government of Israel off the hook. Of course, they're directly perpetrating this genocide in Gaza, but really, until we deal with the U.S. empire and the U.S. government directly, um, that's as the metaphor goes. That's the tentacles in Gaza or Haiti, but the head of the octopus is right here, and we have to have that mass movement to deal with that. Having said that, this was never performative for us. We believed, and we still believe, that our legal arguments were correct. The U.S. ratified in 1988 the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And that was 40 years after the fact. I mean, the convention was formed right after World War II, and the U.S. stonewalled it for 40 years. But they did. And even though when the U.S. ratified it, it did so with exemptions, the U.S. government did not exempt itself from Article 3 of that convention, which prohibits, quote unquote, complicity in genocide. And it's very clear that when Congress made that vote last April, so the House voted on April 20th, the Senate on April 23rd to send that 26.3 billion more military aid. By then it was there was overwhelming evidence that genocide was unfolding in Gaza. Of course, there was the open case against Israel proceeding in the international in the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, and that was pending open litigation. Both Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch had issued reports that that Israel was defying the ICJ provisions to avoid genocide. And then in March, right before the vote, um, the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied territories, Francesca Albanese, issued her report, An Anatomy of a Genocide. All of this was showing, and as constituents, we consistently reached out. Some of us called our congresspeople every day. Some of us, I'm a high school teacher. My students met with Representative Thompson face to face, and in January, 4 months before he voted to send more military aid, and said, "Hey, stop this. This is clear what's happening." And so, despite this evidence, despite the majority opinion of their constituents, despite their obligations to follow the Genocide Convention, um, they voted to re-up. And so the crux of our case is they can't violate a treaty that they've ratified. So per the U.S. Constitution, a ratified treaty becomes part of the supreme law of the land. And there are other Supreme Court cases that establish that tax laws should be used towards the general welfare, as it says in Article 1 of the Constitution. And by no stretch of the imagination can the general welfare or the common defense be construed to include genocide in Gaza. So, so our case, we always took our case seriously. I talk about the past tense because in February, this last February, the federal judge assigned to our case dismissed it for the same reasons that a previous class action against Biden by Palestinian plaintiffs was dismissed. And that is that we were allegedly posing a political question to the court that was non-judiciable. Judiciable is so in other words, the court doesn't make political policy that was outside their parameters. And
Is it similar to the Nuremberg defense that activists use for breaking the law and nonviolent resistance? And then those cases are dismissed because for some reason they don't take the Nuremberg defense seriously. Is it kind of like that?
yeah, well, yeah, absolutely. There's a through line from in I think it was around 2007, the relatives of Rachel Corrie, who was an international volunteer who was going to Evergreen College from Washington State, who was trying to stop the IDF from bulldozing Palestine. She was a volunteer in the West, I think it was in the West Bank, and she's trying to stop IDF soldiers from bulldozing Palestinian families' homes. And one soldier just drove over her and killed her with the bulldozer. That was in the early 2000s, and then also killed Palestinians trying to, I would imagine trying to defend their homes too, non-violently, unarmed. And so Rachel's parents and some of the relatives of the Palestinians who were killed sued Caterpillar Bulldozer, and because the company provided these bulldozers, the Caterpillar company, to the IDF, even though by that point in time the IDF had a track record of using those for war crimes. The case was dismissed by the federal court system in the United States in 2007, I think it was, on the grounds that the court can't intervene and make policy for the other branches. And insofar as Congress had contracted Caterpillar and used our tax dollars to buy the bulldozers, they couldn't hold Caterpillar liable since it was a policy decision by Congress to get the bulldozers. They used the same argument to dismiss about a year ago when, again, the Center for Constitutional Rights filed a lawsuit on behalf of Palestinian plaintiffs against Biden for the genocide and said that the court doesn't deal with policy questions, and then the same for us. The argument is absurd because the court system is all the time making policy decisions. Like just recently, federal courts have intervened and said that Trump can't fire all these federal employees or that they can't cut off USAID funds so abruptly, et cetera, et cetera. So when it comes to genocide and war crimes, that's when they're selectively saying we don't make policy. The courts have to be hands off. So we disagree with that, and it does. contradict the Nuremberg principles, which are that when genocide is happening, it's the responsibility of all organs of government, not to mention ordinary citizens, to stop it.
So, what needs to happen in order for these courts to be forced to take this seriously and not on a basically whimsical basis of now they want to enforce it, now they don't?
Right. Great question. Well, we did a webinar back in January, which was over 1,000 people from across the country signed up for it. And there are people in New York, in Minnesota, in Chicago that are all interested in trying to file similar class actions. We stopped at the district court level. So we didn't take our case to the circuit on an appeal above the district because that circuit court above us had already shot down and appeal the Biden case. So for us, we didn't want to reinforce a bad precedent. We initially thought that because ours case involved domestic taxpayer dollars, that that's a unique angle and that we might be able to get a different ruling from the district court than we got. But once we saw that they were going to play the same uh, political question card that they'd already played here in California, we decided not to reinforce that bad precedent, which means that in other districts, maybe they'll have better judge. Maybe they'll have more luck in New York or Chicago or Minnesota or anywhere else. So we encourage people to do that research and certainly be in communication with us. We would be happy to share our case, our template, our arguments, share what we ran up against, and strategize collectively how other activists and lawyers may be able to prevail elsewhere. But beyond that, we're organizing and filing. We're working with attorneys with the National Lawyers Guild, and we are filing a report in about a week with the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, calling out our officials for complicity in genocide. And we're asking all taxpayers across the country to sign on to that so that when we file the report, and at the end of this podcast, I can give you the information for listeners and viewers to access the sign on. But we want to be able to say, for example, 5,000 taxpayers across the country are demanding accountability, right? So that's one thing is that report is with the United Nations Human Rights Council. Every 4 years, it does what's called a UPR, a Universal Periodic Review of the U.S. government. So it just so happens right after our case got dismissed in federal court that UPR was coming up. And so we decided to utilize that and say, look, we're not getting justice in the federal court system. We want the UN to intervene. And we're going to do the same thing at the end of April with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, where we're filing an official complaint against the U.S. government with that body as well. And they're headquartered in D.C. Last thing I'll say here is that, unfortunately, the UN and the Inter-American Commission do not have ultimate jurisdiction over the U.S. in terms of criminal prosecutions. I mean, what really needs to happen is U.S. officials need to be prosecuted criminally for complicity in genocide. But these arenas, the UN and the Commission, they provide a vehicle for further building a mass movement across the country and connecting with progressive forces in the Americas and throughout the world to further call out the U.S. and develop again that kind of people power to really halt this genocide. And to get findings by the UN and by the Commission that the U.S. is culpable.
So how do you get to that tipping point when we just saw in the election both Trump and Harris basically backing Israel, saying, "What genocide? The emperor is dressed beautifully. I don't know what you're talking about." And the general hypersensitivity of the American people that to be against genocide is to be against Israel, judging the country instead of the
Right.
actions of the government. How do you get enough Americans to stop and realize that no matter what, no matter what happened with the hostages or whatever, it does not justify ethnic cleansing and genocide? How do we connect those dots to build that movement?
It's that is exactly where these the class action and now what we call the international sort of pivot, exactly where those come in, because the course of organizing those actions allows us to communicate with the broader public about the criminality of our own officials and about the illegality of funding genocide. It allows us, many of the plaintiffs are Jewish and, of course, Palestinian, working together to call out the this call out the criminal complicity. Um, but it allows us to do the popular grassroots education that can make the distinctions that need to be made between uh, illegal occupation and genocide, as opposed to, to speak out against illegal occupation genocide is not tantamount to being anti-Semitic. In fact, you know, to conflate Judaism with Zionism, and to conflate Zionism then even further with illegal occupation and the Greater Israel Project or the Manifest Destiny of Israel in that context, that is anti-Semitic. So I think the work we're doing around these cases allows us to educate the public about the need to make those distinctions, and to make the parallels between what's happening to the Palestinians and what's been done inside of the United States against indigenous peoples, and what's been done inside the United States to push people off the land, and to carry out genocide. So that's the kind of education that is happening through our movement, as well as many other. We're just one stream in a larger solidarity river that's been having its ebbs and flows over the last year and a half, but it's now facing intense repression, with the Trump administration kidnapping graduate students across the country and trying to, but we're not backing down. And we are going to see this river keep growing. And once we get a certain strength, like in Haiti, they call it lavalas, the mass movement of the people. Lavalas is a Creole term which means flood. And each of us is a drop of water that when we come together, we become the flood for change. And we just have to keep building towards that until we have a critical mass.
So, talk about some of those organizations that are other drops in the river that you are working with in this movement.
Well, there's certainly JVP, which, I mean, in an individual, many Jewish Voices for Peace, many of the JVP folks are individual members. JVP has some limits as a nonprofit about what it can endorse. So I don't think it's not officially part of the lawsuit, but JVP members and activists have played a really invaluable role. The In each county up here, just like probably out in Michigan and all over the country, there's Palestinian led solidarity organizations so we're working with key Palestinian activists in California, and the various orgs that exist in these counties that they've been providing leadership within. Like, for example, here in Sonoma County, where I'm at, there's Sonoma County for Palestine. There's um, then in Mendocino County, there's parallel organizations, like all these counties I mentioned earlier. There's national organizations that are also involved, like in addition to JVP, like Code Pink. Um, we are working with groups like the Arab Resource Organizing Center, their action wing, um, various Green parties, the DSA. Um, we're working with another progressive Jewish organization out here in the Bay Area, Tikkun, connected to a very progressive synagogue. So it's a variety of groups um, like that, and I think it can provide hopefully a way, a model of trying to unify a movement. Rather, a lot of times our movements can be kind of divided, and we can kind of coalesce around the most basic level that our tax dollars shouldn't be used for this, and we should see a budget within the United States that actually helps working class and impoverished people rather than a tax system that benefits the billionaires and funds genocide.
Do you think that the backlash towards those who voted for Stein and Ware and the blaming of that constituency on Trump's victory, do you think that's a significant impediment to your movement?
I don't, because I think what we're seeing right now, at least I'm sure probably other parts of the country, but certainly speaking out here in California, is um, this is a historic moment for people to build an alternative. People are so disillusioned with both parties, uh, and that people understand that the conditions that gave rise for Trump to come to power in the first place back in 2016 was the corruption and the anti-democratic practices of the Democratic Party in icing out Bernie Sanders. I mean, arguably, I mean, I'm not partisan, I'm independent, I'm not a Democrat, but arguably, the had they not done that, a different outcome could have happened in 2016. It seems pretty clear that what was needed to beat Trump was a mass grassroots movement that was progressive and to the left, not this corporate neoliberal Democratic Party establishment policy. And the same thing happened again in 2020, and then of course in 2024. So what we're seeing out here is people are saying more so than I can remember in my lifetime. We need, whether you call it a third party or maybe what they did in France when they were fighting back the far right, where the moderate to the radical left parties formed a front, like a united front, an alliance. That might be the ticket. So it's not just the Green Party or the various socialist parties, and progressive Democrats. Let's all like form a front to do this. But clearly, people here don't see it in the Democratic Party itself, and that's not the way to defeat fascism at this point.
I've been correcting people when I hear them say uh, half the people voted for Trump, half the people voted for this. No, about a third voted for Trump. A tiny less about a third voted for Harris. One something percent voted for a third party. The biggest percentage in our country did not vote. I
Excellent.
think that the so to quibble about that 1%, instead of saying, how do we engage the majority, which is so disenfranchised, they didn't bother to vote.
That's right. It's such a good
That
point.
that's the people that we need to be thinking about, not villainizing this 1+% because genocide for them was a deal breaker. How do we engage that third of those who have given up on the system? How do
Yeah.
we work with them to bring them into our movement?
Well, again, I think that's where it's helpful to move beyond the two-party straitjacket. Um, that one third you mentioned that didn't vote, we all pay taxes, or at least many of us, right? Not, and we're all upset, over a lack. Even people on the right are upset over deteriorating infrastructure, over they pay all these taxes, and where does and if you really break it down, you say, hey, Elon Musk paid a lower percentage of his billions than you're paying on your hard-earned thousands. People are pissed. So then you say, well, what do we got to show for it? Why are your taxes being used, ha to subsidize 800 military bases and to subsidize um, genocide? What is that? So I think, but we can't have that level of honest conversation within the Democratic Party because it's part of that system that that perpetuates itself. So we get outside of that, and then we can have those conversations, and we can say, yeah, let's build some kind of alliance, some kind of movement that will actually where we actually do have control over our tax dollars. We do have a society that works for the majority, and we do, nobody wants, at the end of the day, very, very few people truly, once they get outside of their angsty, toxic, alienated mindset, very, very few people actually want to pay for the extermination of their fellow human beings. You know, so I think, but that's even a limit with Bernie Sanders, who I respect his efforts. Here he is, 83, going around the country having these fight the oligarchy tours. but there's an outer limit. They can't, because they always bring people back to the Democratic Party. What do you leave? What are you left with other than call your Congress people and tell them to do this and that? But these are the folks that have already demonstrated overwhelmingly that they aren't going to support the kind of restructuring of our society that one third you mentioned. If we had an honest conversation, they'd be like, yeah, instead that's going to be more alienation. What, just go back at home and watch MSNBC and Rachel Maddow and call your congressperson for the 100th time and say, don't do what we know they're going to do anyways. So that strategy's kind of played out.
So let's talk a little bit about, and some of this will be a recap from what you mentioned earlier. What are the next steps for Taxpayers Against Genocide, moving in with the rest of 2025? What are your goals, say, for the rest of the year?
Well, our goals are, most immediately is, we're gonna, on April 7th, we'll file the report calling out our officials, not just in California, but across the country. That when I say officials, I mean the congresspersons, from John Fetterman in the east to, the ones out here in California, like Mike Thompson, calling them out for complicity in genocide. We're also naming both the Biden and the Trump administrations for participating in this. And so that report with the United Nations Human Rights Council will be filed on April 7th. On April 30th, we plan to file the official complaint against the U.S. government for participation in genocide with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And both of those reports, when they're filed, we're going to mass circulate across the country. We're going to use as organizing tools. Should we get hearings as a follow-up to those reports, we will mobilize to have boots on the ground for those hearings, whether they're in DC, whether they're in Geneva. Um, and we will keep organizing with, no matter what happens with those international reports, we'll keep organizing to try to really reach that one third you mentioned and other taxpayers, people who are actually in both parties right now, to say, hey, let's really build a movement around how our tax laws are being used, and and at the same time, we will support organizations like the Tax Resisters. We will also be supporting any other class action lawsuits in other areas across the country that might have more luck than we did out here in California.
If someone wants to get more involved with Taxpayers Against Genocide, how would they go about doing that?
Well, the old-fashioned, or at least old-fashioned relatively, would be just send us an email. We have a very easy email to remember. It's called Class Action Against Genocide at proton.me. Again, that's Class Action Against Genocide at proton.me. But folks can also go to our website, right? And the website is easy to remember. It's just taxpayersagainstgenocide.org, taxpayersagainstgenocide.org, and that links folks to all of our, the way to sign on to this international efforts, um, the um, our social media, etc. So that's a good, helpful tool. And we do say, for folks who are, obviously right now we're living in a period of heightened repression. And so it is definitely not risk-free, even though there's already thousands of people that have signed on, and that, um, it is becoming part of a public petition or public record saying we want our government to be held accountable. And we definitely urge great care to people, especially Palestinian comrades who might be on green cards or on visas. We see what's happening all across. So clearly, we don't want to be cavalier about that, but people that do feel like they have citizenship security and that they feel they're willing to take that a public risk in this movement, this is the time for many of us.
Well, Seth, we'd like to check back in with you in the fall and see, what progress you've made and get a catch up then.
Yeah,
And meanwhile, I thank you for your courage and your devotion, and for being able and willing to speak out.
absolutely. Appreciate you, Carolyn. It's I've heard great things about you through our mutual network, and I'm excited to follow other podcasts you're doing.
Thanks, Seth, for spending time with us today. You're listening to the Whimsy Farm podcast, Good People Doing Good Things for Social and Environmental Justice. I'm Carolyn Crane. Next, I'd like you to meet Dr. Kim Bateman. Kim is a storyteller and end-of-life doula. She's the author of the Indie Award-winning book, Crossing the Owl's Bridge, a guide for grieving people who still love. She is also the executive dean of the Tahoe-Truckee campus of Sierra College in Northern California, where she teaches a popular course on death and dying. Kim and I spoke over Zoom on March 17th. I asked you for your thoughts on grief, especially as it manifests in the political climate. And it was a few weeks ago, I was feeling so horrible, and I thought, this feeling is familiar. How do I know this feeling? And I realized that I remembered it most recently from Jack dying. And I was like, I feel the way I felt when Jack died, as my country died. I mean, what's going on here? So that, I guess that made me think of you too, and your work with grief. And so what do you think? What you got on your mind about all this?
I think there's connections. I think that, if you want to relate it to eco-psychology, I think that's kind of would be a good fit here. Eco-psychology is basically how dynamics in the natural world play themselves out in our own psyches, and how basically killing the environment, like ecocide, is suicide. And there's this parallel. And there's grief around death of the natural world, and there's grief around loss of control and unpredictability in terms of the political environment, which relate both directly to what we feel when we're grieving. We just heard that, 2 weeks ago, Trump signed something that said that 278 million acres of federal lands are now cleared for clear cutting. And, when you're overwhelmed from all these directions, like the death of the natural world, as we lose that connection, our connection to our own inner wild selves fades as well. So I think it is all a dynamic system. And the nature has rhythms. So the bear hibernates, the squirrels and the chickadees cache seeds for the winter. Everything shuts down and does an internal caretaking sort of depressed mode, including the landscape itself. Except for humans, we sort of trudge on and pretend that rhythm doesn't affect us. And it does. Most of the people I know in January are kind of walking around like the gutted wounded, the walking wounded. And instead of honoring that and going inward and kind of taking the shadow part and sitting with it or integrating it, we tend to make resolutions, and we say, I'm going to lose 40 pounds by lunch tomorrow, and I'm going to get my gym membership, and I'm going to write my novel, and we're not actually honoring that internal rhythm.
I was listening to a podcast by this guy named Lee Harris, who does a lot of energy work. He's kind of woo-woo, a little too woo-woo for some people maybe, but I like him. And he has themes every month. And one of his themes for this month was the slow lane is actually the fast lane. And I think he was talking about what you're talking about, that when you need to slow down and honor that process, you end up actually further ahead in the long run because you've taken that time to hibernate and incubate and whatever it is you need to do.
I mean, if you look at the national statistics, like according to the CDC, anxiety has risen from about, let me just make sure I got these numbers right, from 11% to 19% over the last 3 years. Depression has also risen from 8 to 20%. So we're more anxious, we're more depressed. It could be that we just have better fluency around that and we're talking about it more. But Every day, 45 million Americans are taking an antidepressant. We have difficulty as a culture with sitting with uncomfortable feelings, sitting in the darkness, sitting with complexity. We love simple answers. We love this promise of here's a pill and you're going to be happy. And anybody who's taken an antidepressant knows that all it does is sort of lift you a little bit up off the bottom. It doesn't make you happy. But, and I think this is, yeah, if I could use an analogy, if you've ever been to the Bellagio Hotel, and anyway, they have 90,000 flowers in full bloom, no matter what day of the year you walk in there. And it turns out they have these huge trays that as soon as they start to decay, they pull them under the ground and they don't let you see that part of the cycle. And they only pull them up when they're fully blooming, which I think is a lovely metaphor for what we do as particularly Americans is we love you when you're productive and when you're happy. And then we're made to feel like something is wrong, that we should hide the decay, we should hide the disintegration, we should hide the shadow. And those are parts of the cycle, and they're important to sit with. Those icky feelings, as much as we want them to go away, we have to acknowledge them or they don't. It's very similar to grief. You can't just think grief away, as you know. You have to actually feel it. And grief is as organic as your relationship with the deceased person. They're all different and it comes in waves. And honoring those waves and having someone who can sit with you in those dark places and actually reflect what they feel like, to me, is the way through. Because sometimes breakdown is breakthrough. And just naming those feelings gives them a lot less power over you.
Oh, I think that one thing that's interesting that's happened here in Milan, which is it's a little town that's a suburb of Ann Arbor and Detroit, in Southeast Michigan, and someone actually, the woman who cuts my hair, her visceral reaction to Trump winning in November was to start a Facebook group called the Milan Collective for Change. And we got hacked right away, so she had to redo it and make the things stricter because some haters got in there right away. But one of the things we've talked about now is that group grows over 200, and we have meetups, and we have a Zoom self-care workshop that someone has started every week, and we're building a community that in fact we never would have built if Harris had won. And so that's interesting to me, is that it's this catalyst for creating a community that we needed anyway, but we didn't know we needed, or did we need it? Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, and connection is the antidote to lots of things. Depression, addiction. And so coming together in community is a really beautiful way to do both things, to sit with the feelings that are uncomfortable, but also to then problem solve and make an action plan.
Can you talk a little more about the similarities of grieving a person with grieving a situation?
I think that in both cases, we're very bad as a culture in sitting with suffering. So instead of having these feelings and having someone just say, wow, that's awful, or that's dark, or wow, how hard for you, we, in both cases, get a lot of advice giving first, which is, if you can hear what advice does, it moves you from the heart to the head. And it's actually very hierarchical. So it doesn't work very well. It's like someone saying, oh, you're feeling mad. Why don't you do yoga or meditate? It's like people jump to solutions in both places. I think there's a lot of narcissism in the way people listen. There's story topping. There's deciding how someone else should feel when not letting them have their own feelings. there's also platitudes like everything happens for a reason, or in time, all will heal, which, if you can hear that, doesn't match the feeling place that people are in. So the comparison to me is, I think a lot of us are walking around very wounded by what's going on and also feeling very powerless. And I don't think there's a lot of containment or reflection of what that feeling is. And so we sort of try to rise above it and problem solve before we're actually ready to. It's like someone telling you after the death of someone dear to you, well, isn't it time you got back to work? Isn't it time you got back to life? Isn't it time you started dating again? Or, you could have another child. It's like you're
Or
jumping
it's a
to,
good idea to keep busy.
yeah,
You need
yeah,
to keep busy. That's one
yeah,
I heard a lot. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So um, it's not just people's reactions to it, it's also the feelings of it, because we go through feelings of denial, of shock. We sometimes feel very angry. We can feel angry at others, at ourselves, at people who voted for the other side, at God, at the administration itself. We can feel despair, and that's a very dark place. Feeling like nothing is moving and nothing we do is going to make a difference. Um, and the
And
thing
let's
is,
talk a little more about, oh, I'm sorry, but I wanted to say, let's talk a little more about blaming the third. So I'm hearing this a lot, like half the people in this
mm,
country wanted this. First of all, that's not true. It was 31% who voted for Trump, so that's less than a third.
right.
So, but blaming that third and being
Mhm,
angry at that third and wishing,
mhm,
voodoo doll-like things on that third, which are, things I've heard from people I love. Um,
mhm,
I don't, I don't like that. It makes me feel uncomfortable.
mhm,
Is it because I'm uncomfortable with anger and I should get over it, or is it because
mhm,
that's not a good thing, or is it both?
mhm. Yeah, that's a good question. I think as women, particularly, we have a strange relationship with anger because we're always taught that we should never feel that. And yet, anger is also a way of saying what you believe in and what you stand for. It's interesting because as women, we can be angry on behalf of someone else, but we often can't be angry on behalf of ourselves. Um, So I think there might be a discomfort with anger. Um, but more than that, I think you're also a compassionate person who's trying to see that these people had their reasons, and it would be more conducive to peace and moving forward if you could understand what those reasons were and try to go into it rather than pushing it away. So you as a connected, compassionate person, I can see why anger would be uncomfortable for you, because everything in you is telling you to reach out and try to figure out what's going on for that people could feel so different, because this election above all others feels like it's about values. It doesn't feel like it's just about issues. It feels like deep personal values. And so I think it's upsetting to feel like, wow, a third of the country doesn't feel like I do about these things. So going at it with curiosity, which I think is more of, I mean, what I'm trying to do and what you're trying to do. I live with this at my dinner table. So this is not um, like a them that's out there. This is my own family, several members of my own family. So trying to go at it with curiosity, and then sometimes I dip into anger too. It's hard not to. But like grief, I think anger is a pretty natural response to pain, to hurt.
What do you think is the best way for people who are now called part of the resistance, for
Mm.
those who do not want Trump's agenda to continue? What do you think is the best way for them to take care of themselves and also further their agenda?
I think the first thing is what you already said. It's connecting with one another and getting support from one another, creating places of community, and then having a space for the expression of those difficult feelings and having someone there who can reflect those and validate those, and then coming up with action plans. And some of those action plans, I believe, and this is just my personal opinion, I'm not an authority on, social change. I'm trying to have those conversations at my dinner table, because if I can't talk to my own parents about these differences, I have no faith in the world if I can't do that at my own dinner table. So that's where I'm starting, with and trying to be curious, trying to say, I'm wondering what's going on for you, or what are you thinking here, or what are you hoping for? I called my mother on the day of the election, and it took a lot of thoughtfulness on my part, but I was able to practice and come out with the words, Mom, I sincerely hope that this administration gives you what you're hoping for, and that is safety and economic vitality. I'm worried about some things, particularly at my school, and how this affects some of our students. But I sincerely hope for the same things that you do. And so that is a reminder that we actually share values, even though we don't see them playing out in the same way. Now, I haven't revisited that conversation with her in quite some time, so I think it may be time to do that again.
So you're saying it's the opposite of cancel culture.
Yes. Yes. I mean, you think about someone you're worried about who's drinking too much. You can do an intervention and put your foot down and have your whole family come out and demand that they get into rehab, and maybe that works sometimes. Or you can go at it from a place of curiosity and say, how are you feeling about, your alcohol use, and where are you in this process? Because treating them with respect and intelligence, they've thought about this, is, to me, the only doorway to open towards healing, especially in addiction, is having it be their idea to change, not my idea for them.
How much of this bifurcation that we're seeing do you think comes from the media people watch rather than their own values?
I would say 95% of it. I've watched both of my parents. My parents are both remarried, and I've watched them. When you listen to some of those Fox News over and over, and you hear those stories over and over and over, they feel real to you. And there's not the critical thinking to look at other sources. A lot of mornings in my breakfast table, we look at the headlines from 4 or 5 different news sources. And there can be some pretty serious things going on. And if you look at Fox News, 3 out of 5 of the stories are about transgendered athletes, or, some issue that they're really blowing up and getting a lot of mileage off of. So it's all based on fear, and they're hitting that nerve really well. By making people afraid, and especially older generations, I think, are really susceptible to those stories.
So that really means that if we think of 95% and we think of the fear, all the more reason to use that curiosity mindset. And because when I'm afraid, I know it helps me to feel heard, to have my
Yeah.
fears heard and not dismissed.
One time, last summer, we were sitting there, about 6 of us at the table, all with very different beliefs. And I said, how news gives us the algorithm that makes us most afraid, so we keep reading. When you read the news, what are you most afraid of? And it was one of the most beautiful conversations I've had with my family about this. Because I said, my news feed is giving me school shootings all the time. So I feel like, an armed person is going to walk in our school at any time. And that terrifies me. and if you look at the people watching Fox News, the fear that they have is all around. My mom thinks that someone's going to take her money. Or my stepdad thinks our military's being weakened, or, and you just say, wow, like we're in the same family and we have such radically different fears, and they come directly from the stories that we're being fed. But if you look, okay, I'll tell you an example of a story with my mom. She read something and she said to me, did you hear that in Wisconsin, they are forcing kindergartners into sex change operations without their parents' consent? Okay, so I'm telling you one situation that went well. So I'll give you that caveat. So I said, okay, she needs to hear the validation of her fear. For her, that's awful, right? And I said, that sounds horrible. That sounds just horrible, Mom. Wow, let's look that up. I want to see what's going on there, because that shouldn't be happening. And so we looked it up. She knew the name of the organization that was doing this, and we looked it up, and I said, well, look, Mom, it looks like a family strengthening organization. They go into kindergartners and they talk about different forms of family, that you can be raised by a grandmother or in a foster home or by two moms or two dads or maybe just a mom. And as long as you have safety and love, it's a good home, a loving home. And she said, I believe in that, because she was a single mom. And I said, I believe in it too. And now we have confirmed that we both have the same values. So then the next thing I said was, what is it about the way stories are being spun that somehow it's presented as people being forced into sex change operations? And that was a little harder. The kind of conversation kind of fell off then, but I've been really practicing holding my own reactivity, trying to really deeply listen to what's underneath this, what fear is being hit, so that we can create commonalities in our values and then sort out, wow, where's all this information? Where are these stories coming from that are inaccurate? And I wonder too, on the other side, I'll say right to my mom, I have no idea if the stories I'm getting are true either. So I'm trying very hard to look at other sources and see, how, and my whole Facebook is filled with people, very extreme in one direction. So
it is important to realize that is definitely a two-way street, and media that's for profit is going to be first for profit, which means entrapping people into their narrative to keep them through the next commercial or through their, that's literally its purpose. Mm-hmm. So, and media that's not for profit is lower budget, and it's less sensational. Mm-hmm. So when people are used to a certain level of sensationalism to keep their attention, mm-hmm. and they see something that's not as sensational, they tend to think, well, this isn't telling me anything. This is boring. They turn it off. They go to the more sensational. So that's I think the overall dynamic that we find in media today is they have to, they have to grab you in the first 10 seconds. So, kindergartens and sex change, that's going to grab you pretty quick.
Yeah. So I try to remind myself to hold my reactivity, to listen first, to then offer something else. And then this is the most important part, switch back to active listening, switch back to active listening, switch back. Because you may have to do that 5, 6, 7, 8 times in a conversation to actually have a conversation. But it's still really hard work.
It is. And how do you hold back that reactivity? How do you learn that?
Yeah, I think that's a good one. Some people like to take a breath. For me, I used to do a lot of therapist work, and I have this one trick where I hold my finger together like this, which means shut up. So I'll do that to myself. It's something physical. It reminds me, just hold that thought. You don't need to fill the space.
Let's talk a minute about silence, because I think sometimes silence can be a powerful conduit and people are afraid of it. How do we learn to live with, say, you're actively listening and there's silence?
Mm.
How do we learn to navigate that in a constructive way?
Mm. Yeah, I think it's probably just awareness that you don't have to fill that space. And that maybe they're not even coming to you asking for a solution. They're coming asking for your presence. And you know that from grief, that no one can walk in and say the right thing ever. They can listen and they can be quiet and be present. That's about it.
Thanks for the words of wisdom, Kim. That's it for the Whimsy Farm podcast today. I'm Carolyn Crane, your host and producer. Thanks to Seth Donnelly from Taxpayers Against Genocide and storyteller and end-of-life doula Kim Bateman for being our guest today. This podcast is produced on the sacred ancestral land of the Anishinaabe people. Thanks to the California band Castle House for writing and performing our music. That's Jen Knapp on lead vocals with China and Chilean Cop backing her up. Thanks to our underwriter, Just Play Productions, for its support of today's podcast. Thanks to all of you supporting us on Patreon as well. If you'd like to offer your support, please visit our website, whimsyfarm.net, and click the Patreon link to find a level of support that's right for you. And there's also a free membership level. You can email me through this website as well. That's whimsyfarm.net. The Whimsy Farm podcast airs the 1st and 15th of each month on our YouTube channel, Carolyn Crane and Whimsy Farm, on our website, and wherever you find your favorite podcasts. We'll be back on May 1st to speak with sociologist Betsy Leander Wright about her new book, Is It Racist? Is It Sexist? We'll see you then. Meanwhile, please remember the words of Utah Phillips. Too many people are doing too many good things to afford me the luxury of being pessimistic. Take care, everyone.
whimsyfarms.net